He believed he had control over everything, even on Valentine's Day. But there he was dining alone until he saw her, his ex. And with her, 3 identical children. 3 years of silence. 3 kids he never knew existed. Now it was all or nothing. The soft hum of conversation filled the upscale restaurant, an orchestra of laughter, whispered confessions, and the delicate clinking of glasses. John Hastings sat alone at his table, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, watching as the ice slowly melted into the depths of his whiskey. He was not a man given to nostalgia, nor one who indulged in sentimentality. Emotions, in his world, were distractions, unpredictable elements he had long since eradicated from his carefully curated life. His empire was built on precision and unwavering control. Every deal, every acquisition, every move was planned to perfection. But fate had never been a part of his calculations. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the polished mahogany walls. As John lifted the glass to his lips, his gaze landed on a vision from his past. Across the room, seated with the same effortless grace that had once haunted his dreams, was Mary Nike. Her laughter, warm, genuine, curled through the air like an intoxicating melody. But it wasn't just Mary that held him captive. Seated beside her were 3 small figures, 2 identical boys and a little girl. Their bright eyes shimmered with mischief, their features eerily familiar. John's grip tightened around his glass. His pulse pounded, deafening against his ribs. The world around him blurred, and for the first time in years, John Hastings, the man who had mastered control, felt it slipping away. The boys were mirror images of him at that age, his sharp jawline, the same piercing blue eyes that had once stared back at him from old family portraits. The little girl, delicate yet fierce in the way she held herself, had Mary's fiery determination written all over her. A wave of realization crashed over him, brutal and inescapable. These weren't just any children. They were his. And he had never known. The restaurant, once a haven of predictability, now felt suffocating. John set his glass down with a quiet thud, his mind spinning with questions. 3 years. 3 years since Mary had walked out of his life, severing the last frayed thread of what they had once been. He had told himself he had moved on, that whatever emotions he had once harbored for her had been buried beneath the weight of ambition. But now, as he watched her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, as he noticed the way her fingers rested protectively on the back of one of the boys, the past clawed its way to the surface. He had to move. He had to act. The questions burned inside him, igniting something dangerous. Rising to his feet, he crossed the restaurant, ignoring the murmured conversations and curious glances from other diners. His focus was singular. With every step, the reality of what had been stolen from him grew heavier. Mary looked up just as he reached the table. Her smile faded, replaced with something unreadable. But it was her eyes, wide, startled, filled with unspoken truths that told him everything he needed to know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The children, oblivious to the storm brewing between the adults, chattered amongst themselves, their small hands playing with the silverware. John swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are they mine?" The words hung between them like a live wire, charged with years of absence, regret, and things left unsaid. Mary's lips parted, and for a fleeting second, John saw something raw flicker in her expression: guilt, fear. Then, with a quiet breath, she nodded. "Yes, John. They're yours." The world tilted. The ground vanished beneath his feet. 3 years. 3 children. 3 lives he had unknowingly abandoned. His heart pounded. His mind raced to catch up with the brutal truth before him. His entire life had been built on power and dominance, on ensuring that nothing ever happened beyond his control. But this shattered everything. And for the first time in his life, John Hastings had no idea what to do next. The silence between them stretched, a gaping void filled with words neither of them knew how to say. John stood rigid, every muscle coiled tight, his mind a battlefield of anger, confusion, and an aching sense of loss. Mary met his gaze, her own eyes wet but steady. She had always been like that, unshaken, even in the face of the storm that was John Hastings. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he forced himself to breathe. 3 years, Mary, he said, his voice low, dangerous. 3 years, and you never told me? She exhaled slowly, the weight of her decision evident in the slump of her shoulders. I tried, she said, barely above a whisper. I called. I left messages. But you never answered, John. A sharp pang shot through him. He had ignored those calls. He had assumed she was reaching out in desperation, hoping to salvage something already broken. But now, as he stared at the faces of his children, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He glanced at the boys first. The one on the left, Mark, Mary had told him over the phone, watched him with guarded suspicion. The other, Glory, was more relaxed, his head tilted in curiosity. The little girl, Emma, clung to Mary's sleeve, her dark eyes flickering between her mother and the stranger who had interrupted their dinner. John swallowed hard and turned back to Mary. Why didn't you try harder? Her eyes flashed. You think I didn't, she shot back. You were untouchable, John. Your assistant blocked me. Your number changed. And even if I had gotten through, do you really think you would have listened? He hated that she was right. Hated that he had been so consumed by ambition that he had shut out everything else. But this wasn't something he could walk away from. I want to meet them, he said firmly. Mary's jaw tightened. This isn't just about what you want. They don't know you, John. You can't just. They're mine, he interrupted, his voice raw, edged with something dangerously close to desperation. I lost 3 years. I won't lose anymore. Mary studied him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair.
Fine, she said at last.
Tomorrow. The park near my house. Noon. And with that, she turned back to the children, her expression softening as she ushered them toward the door. John watched them go, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar mix of dread and longing. Tomorrow. He had until tomorrow to figure out how to be a father. John swallowed hard and took a step forward. Hi, he said, feeling ridiculous for not knowing what else to say. Glory was the first to respond. Are you the guy from last night? Mary sighed. Glory, we talked about this. It's okay, John murmured. He crouched slightly, trying to meet them at eye level. Yeah, I'm the guy from last night. Mark narrowed his eyes. Who are you? The question sliced through him. He was their father, yet to them, he was no one. He hesitated, glancing at Mary for guidance, but she remained silent. He turned back to the children. I'm John, and I'd really like to get to know you. Glory tilted his head. Like, know us how? John exhaled a small chuckle, though his chest felt painfully tight. Well, maybe we could start with playing. What do you guys like to do? Glory beamed. I like to race, but you can't catch me. With that, he took off, his small legs carrying him across the playground. John looked at Mark, but the boy only shrugged. He's fast, he said, unimpressed. Meanwhile, Emma stared at John with wide eyes before turning to Mary. Mommy, I'm thirsty. Mary gave John a pointed look before reaching into her bag for a water bottle. She's shy, she said quietly. Give her time. John nodded, his gaze flickering back to Mark, who was still watching him with silent skepticism. This was going to be harder than he thought. But as he saw Glory laughing on the monkey bars and Emma quietly sipping her water, something inside him shifted. He had spent his whole life fighting for things he thought mattered. Now he realized he had been fighting for all the wrong things. Over the next few days, John made it his mission to spend time with the children. He showed up at the park every afternoon. Though Mary remained hesitant, she didn't stop him. Glory was the easiest to win over. Fearless and full of energy, he dragged John into every new adventure, climbing trees, playing tag, and sharing his endless curiosity about dinosaurs and outer space. He embraced John's presence without hesitation. Emma was more reserved but slowly began warming up to him. She would sit beside him on the bench, listening as he read stories aloud, though she rarely spoke. Over time, she started offering him small gestures of acceptance, a flower she found in the grass, a whispered good night when he walked them home, a hesitant smile that felt like winning the lottery. Mark, however, was a different story. One evening, as John walked them back to Mary's apartment, Mark lagged behind, his face set in a stubborn scowl. John slowed his pace, waiting for the boy to catch up. "What's on your mind, buddy?" he asked lightly. Mark glared up at him. "Are you going to leave?" The words hit John like a punch to the gut. "Why would you think that?" he asked carefully. Mark shrugged, looking away. "Because that's what people do." John exhaled, crouching down so they were at eye level. "Mark, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere." The boy's expression didn't change. "That's what my mom thought too." John had no response to that. For the first time, he truly understood the damage he had done. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had to prove. The days stretched into a routine, one John had never anticipated but found himself unwilling to abandon. He showed up at the park every day. Sometimes, Mary stayed, watching from a distance, her arms crossed in a stance more about self-preservation than hostility. Other times, she left him alone with the children, an unspoken test of his resolve. Glory remained his biggest champion, always eager to pull him into games or bombard him with questions. Emma, though still shy, had begun offering him small pieces of herself. But Mark made him work for every inch. One afternoon, as John attempted to teach Glory how to properly kick a soccer ball, Mark stood off to the side, arms folded, scowling. John ignored it for as long as he could before finally walking over. "You don't like me very much, do you?" John asked, keeping his voice even. Mark's glare was sharp. "I don't trust you." John nodded, expecting that answer. "Fair enough. But I'd like the chance to change that." Mark's jaw tightened. "Why now?" John hesitated. There was no easy answer. "Because I was stupid before. Because I thought the things I was chasing mattered more than what I left behind. And because I can't change the past, but I want to be here now." Mark didn't respond. He simply studied John with a depth far beyond his years before finally muttering, "We'll see." It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, John found himself sitting on a park bench with Mary. The children were asleep at home, and for the first time in years, they were alone. "You're really trying," she admitted, her voice softer than he expected. He turned to her. "I don't know how to be a father, Mary, but I want to be." She sighed, rubbing her hands together. "It's not just about showing up, John. It's about being consistent. About proving to them that you're here to stay." John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve to just walk in and have everything fall into place. But I'm here." Mary hesitated before looking up at him. "Why did you ignore me back then?" His stomach tightened. He had known this question was coming. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I let you in, if I let anything distract me, I'd lose everything I worked for." Mary studied him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" John met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Now I realize that everything I worked for means nothing if I don't have them." For the first time, Mary's expression softened, but the walls around her heart were still there. He could see them, feel them, and he knew breaking them down would take more than just words. The night was cold, the air thick with unspoken words. John had just dropped the children off when, as he walked away, he heard the door open again. "John." He turned. Mary stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. "Come inside." It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. He stepped through the threshold, and for the first time in 3 years, he was inside her home. It was warm, lived in, filled with small details that spoke of the life she had built without him. Pictures on the wall, toys scattered across the floor, a home that had no space for him until now. Mary walked to the kitchen, pouring them both a cup of tea. "The kids are asleep," she said, sliding one cup toward him. John took it, watching her carefully. "You don't have to do this." She exhaled. "Maybe I do." For a long moment, They just sat there, the weight of their past between them. Then finally, Mary looked up. Do you really think you can be their father? John didn't hesitate. I know I can. Mary held his gaze for a long time before finally nodding. And just like that, everything had changed. The first time Emma let him carry her to the car. The first time Glory reached for his hand, without hesitation. The first time Mark didn't flinch when John ruffled his hair. And yet, Mary remained his greatest challenge. One evening, as John prepared to leave after spending time with the children, Mary lingered by the door. They're getting used to you, she said cautiously. He nodded. That's the goal. She hesitated. But I need to know something, John. Are you here for them? Or are you here to fix your own guilt? The question struck like a blow. He wanted to snap back, to tell her she was being unfair, but deep down, he knew the truth. He didn't have an answer that would satisfy her. I'm here because I should have been from the start, he said finally. Mary searched his face for a long moment before nodding. I hope that's true. But something in her tone told him she wasn't convinced yet. John had spent his life winning deals, winning negotiations, winning at the cost of everything else. But winning Mark's trust was proving to be the hardest battle of all. One rainy afternoon, John picked the kids up from school. Glory chattered excitedly about his day. Emma clung to his arm. But Mark remained silent, staring out the window. As they reached Mary's apartment, Mark finally spoke. You left her. John turned, startled. What? You left my mom, Mark repeated, his voice steady but cold. That's why I don't trust you. John exhaled. Mark, You hurt her. The words were a gut punch. John had been so focused on building his relationship with the children that he had ignored the scars he had left on Mary. I did, John admitted, his voice quieter now. And I regret it every day. Mark finally looked at him, searching for something, maybe a lie, maybe an excuse. You better not do it again, he muttered before stepping out of the car. John sat there long after the door shut, realizing that his biggest battle wasn't just proving himself to his children. It was proving himself to the woman he had broken. Everything shattered on a Tuesday. John had promised to take the kids to the aquarium after school. He had cleared his schedule, sworn that nothing would come between them. But when a last-minute business emergency arose, John found himself making a choice he had once considered simple: work. By the time he arrived at Mary's apartment, disappointment was palpable. Glory sulked. Emma clung to Mary. And Mark stared at him with a coldness that burned. You said you'd be there, Mark accused. I know, buddy, I don't. Don't call me that, Mark snapped. You're just like before. John felt the weight of his failure settle in his chest. Mark, Mary cut him off. Go home, John. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was tired. John opened his mouth to argue, but Mary turned away, ushering the children inside. The door closed, and for the first time since this all began, John felt the true weight of what he stood to lose. He sat in his car, staring at the closed door. The weight of his failure pressed against his chest like a vice. He had spent weeks trying to prove that he had changed, that he was more than the man who had once prioritized power over love. And in one missed promise, he had confirmed Mary's worst fear, that he was still the same. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. A reminder of yet another meeting, another responsibility, demanding his attention. He ignored it. Instead, he stepped out of the car and walked back to the door. His knock was hesitant, uncertain. It took a long moment before Mary answered. She didn't look surprised to see him, but she didn't look pleased either. John, she sighed. I need to fix this, he said quietly but firmly. I need to fix what I broke. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You can't just fix it, John. This isn't a contract negotiation. You don't just say the right things and make it all go away. He swallowed hard. Then tell me how to make it right. She studied him, her expression unreadable. You can't keep making promises you won't keep. The kids, Mark, they need consistency. They need to know you won't disappear the moment things get complicated. John nodded slowly. I get that. Do you? Her eyes searched his. Because if you really do, you'll stop trying to fix everything in one grand gesture and start proving yourself every single day. Her words hit him like a slap. He had always been a man of big moves, dramatic decisions. But this wasn't something he could fix with money or power. This was about showing up every day without fail. A small sound interrupted them, a weak, muffled cough from inside. Mary's expression shifted, worry flickering across her face. John frowned. What was that? She didn't answer. Instead, she pushed the door open and walked inside. He followed. Mark lay on the couch, curled under a blanket. His face was pale, his forehead damp with sweat. Glory and Emma sat nearby, unusually quiet. He's been sick since last night, Mary murmured, brushing Mark's damp hair back. It's just a fever, but he's been exhausted all day. John moved without thinking. He knelt beside the couch, resting his palm gently against Mark's forehead. The boy stirred, but didn't pull away. I'll stay, John said softly. Whatever you need. However long it takes. Mary hesitated, her guard still up. But then she nodded. And for the first time, John felt like he had taken a real step forward. The night stretched long and slow. Mark's fever remained high, and Mary barely left his side. John stayed too, fetching cold compresses, holding Emma when she got scared, making sure Glory was settled. Hours passed. Sometime near dawn, Mark stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. In the dim light of the living room, he looked at John. You're still here, he murmured, his voice hoarse. John swallowed the lump in his throat. I told you, buddy. I'm not going anywhere. Mark studied him for a long moment, then, with a small nod, closed his eyes again. By morning, the fever had broken. Mark was still weak, but he was awake, and that alone felt like a victory. Mary made coffee, exhaustion lining her face. John sat across from her at the kitchen table, watching her stir her mug absently. You really stayed, she murmured, almost to herself. I meant what I said, John replied. I'm here for them. And for you. Mary let out a small breath, rubbing her temples. I don't know how to trust that, John. He reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his own. Then let me prove it. Every day. For a long time, Mary didn't say anything. Then, finally, she looked at him. Stay for breakfast, she said softly. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a second chance. But it was a beginning. And this time, John wouldn't waste it.